So the miracle is this: the more you share, the more you have. Never have Mr. Spock's words been more relevant as they are today. So good evening, everyone. My name's Benita Matowska, otherwise known as the Chief Sharer, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the RSA for tonight's special event on the sharing economy. Before we get started, can I just ask you to turn off your mobile phones? We are live streaming tonight's event, so welcome to those who are online. And just a reminder that the hashtag tonight is sharing economy. That's the same hashtag that I started some 6 years ago. Now, I'm especially pleased to be introducing tonight's event as chair of the steering group for the RSA's Towards a Fairer Sharing Economy project. I first brought the topic of the sharing economy to the RSA some 6 years ago. And back then, the very idea of putting the words sharing and economy in the same sentence together seemed bizarre at best. Now when you Google the term sharing economy, you get 18.5 million results. So how far we've come. Yet, of course, the challenges that we face are many. As a global expert and leader in this rapidly growing sector, I've been involved from the earliest days as the founder of The People Who Share, a social enterprise and movement that helps people and companies discover the sharing economy and aims to mainstream it globally. As many of you know, we're the organisation behind Global Sharing Week that's coming up on the 5th of June. As an RSA Fellow, I was delighted when the Society began to take an interest in exploring the social and economic implications of a growing sharing economy, with the aim of ensuring that it benefits the common good. It's been truly rewarding to see the impact of the research and policy recommendations that project lead Brimi Balaram has produced so far. I hope all of you will check out the RSA's website for Brimi's latest report, Fair Share, Reclaiming Power in the Sharing Economy. It's a great and important read. Today I've been judging the RSA Student Design Awards, the Sharing Economy entries. And I'm really inspired by the passion of the budding social entrepreneurs that I've met today. As someone steeped in the sharing economy, I know how influential and inspiring Rachel Botsman's work has been to many people. So on behalf of the RSA and our partners at Airbnb, whose support makes evenings like this possible, I thank you, Rachel, for delivering the first event in a new series, bringing the latest thinking on the key current issues facing the sharing economy to a wider public. To introduce Rachel to you more fully and to chair this evening's conversation, we were due to be joined by Jonathan Ford, Chief Leader Writer at the Financial Times. But sadly, Jonathan's been taken ill. So instead, the RSA's very own Matthew Taylor has agreed to step in. So thank you all for coming and sharing. I know it'll be a great evening, and I look forward to meeting many of you at the drinks afterwards. I'm Benita Matowska. Thanks for sharing, and now over to Matthew. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Benita. Jonathan's misfortune is clearly my gain, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing this evening's discussion and to introduce Rachel to you. As you'll be aware, Rachel is an authority on how collaboration and sharing is changing the way in which we live, work and consume. Her theory of collaborative consumption was defined in her first book, What's Mine is Yours, which appeared in 2010. It was hailed by Time magazine as one of the 10 ideas that will change the world. Rachel defines the collaborative economy as a system of decentralized networks and marketplaces that unlocks the value of underused assets by matching needs and haves in ways that bypass traditional middlemen. She's since designed the world's, it says the world's MBA course. Is that first or only? There's a missing adjective there. Is it both?
Both.
Great. She has since designed the world's first and only MBA course on the sharing economy, which she teaches at Oxford University Side Business School. Rachel's a regular contributor to many distinguished journals, and she's currently working on her new book on the future of trust. Tonight, Rachel will be addressing the state of the sharing economy, and as someone who's been thinking about the sharing economy for longer than almost anyone else in the field, it's going to be fascinating to hear your thoughts on how we got to where we are now and where you think we're going next. After Rachel's opening presentation, there'll be plenty of time for conversation and exchange, and we're looking forward very much to hearing your thoughts and questions. I know there's a lot of people in the room who are participants in the sharing economy. So without further ado, Let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Botsman.
Thank you very much. It is lovely to be here this evening. When the RSA team reached out, they approached me with an interesting question. And the question they asked me was, do you ever think about what you got completely wrong or what you completely missed when you first started thinking about these ideas? And I said, yes, this is something I think about a lot, but I don't often have the opportunity to talk about. So I'm hoping for a very honest and challenging conversation this evening. I'm also hoping, or I should say praying, that we do not end up talking about Uber, because I am slightly Uber it or over it. So if we could move beyond that, that would be great. So what I thought I would do is just share some thoughts, and a good place to start is, what exactly is the sharing economy? One of the things I never realized was how many ideas you could attach to an idea. And I now keep a diary of all the ideas and names that it is given. So the collaborative economy, the mesh economy, the network economy, the rental economy, the access economy, hipponomics. Someone the other day asked if it should be called cross-dressing capitalism. So this thing has many names, and these ideas are connected in some way. So let me give you my view of what the sharing economy is and why it is full of so much potential, but it's complicated because it represents such a broad range of ideas. So I'm going to give you two examples that really sit at the extreme of what this idea represents. The first, some of you, and I realize that Airbnb is sponsoring this event, so I apologize that I'm starting with Love Home Swap, their main competitor. But anyway, Love Home Swap is a different experience. I use Love Home Swap, and basically if you have a home, especially if you're going on long stay, or person like myself, I have two young kids who travel with me. We literally swap our homes. We've recently done this in Oxford. It is a magical experience. I didn't have to bring with a pram, a car seat, a bib, a mug. I swapped homes with a professor who happened to have two young grandchildren. And the interesting thing about home swapping is it does feel different from Airbnb, because you create this really interesting social contract with the person that you're swapping with. So you go through many email exchanges over small and big things. So are you going to clear out all your wardrobes? Are you going to leave photos of you and your husband in the bedroom? Please remove them. All these things that are actually very important to making real, genuine sharing work. Now, what's happening on Love Home Swap, it represents one of the core principles that has got slightly lost around the sharing economy, and this is this idea of idling capacity. So idling capacity represents the untapped social, economic, and environmental value of underused assets. And these assets can literally be anything. They tend to fall into three categories. So you have physical stuff, so homes, cars, dresses, kids' toys, physical stuff. You then have labor assets, so people's time, skills, human potential. And then you have capital assets, so anything from crowdfunding to crowd equity, all the way through to peer-to-peer lending platforms. And what's happening is that we're taking this capacity and we're making it liquid through networks and marketplaces. And it's interesting because this slide started it all for me. I think I have presented this slide about 10,000 times, and I'm not exaggerating, but it is really important because it shows the two things that technology was doing 9 years ago, but wasn't doing particularly well, in that we could now create the efficiency to match supply and demand in different ways. But that technology could also create social profiles, reputation ratings, identity verification for us to trust strangers in ways on a scale that have never been possible. And the interesting thing was I started writing my book in 2009, and there is hardly any mention of the smartphone. which is frightening, a huge omission on my part. But the smartphone was the game changer because the smartphone removed the friction from these platforms, but it also created all these tremendous trust tools to bring down the barriers of strangers trusting one another. So you see these two principles, idling capacity and the ability of technology to match supply and demand through efficiency and trust at the basis of these examples. Just to give you a completely different end of the spectrum, I get to meet many wonderful entrepreneurs in the space, and this was a gentleman I met recently, or I should say this is a photo this gentleman took. His name is Mark Slaughter, and Mark used to sell medical equipment to hospitals. And what he started doing was taking photographs of piles of medical equipment left in strange places of the hospital, so in storage cupboards and in hallways. And then he would go to other hospitals that couldn't even afford to buy, in this instance, one incubator. Now, what Mark was seeing was a classic broken system of supply and demand. And what Mark was seeing was what many entrepreneurs in the space say, you know, how can we extract more value from these existing assets? And he started to dig into this problem, and it's just an example of how profound idling capacity can be. So what he discovered was that the average piece of equipment will sit idle for 58% of its entire life cycle. And this results of a third of all surgeries that cannot be performed is because there isn't equipment available. So we created this platform called Cohelo. It's now just been named one of the most innovative health companies in the States, and it takes the unused capacity of expensive health equipment and redistributes it amongst different hospitals. He's managed to take the capacity of hospital equipment from 48% to 70% in the course of 18 months. So here you have two very different examples, home swapping and getting hospitals to share equipment. And they are both great examples of this thing that we call the sharing economy. I'd be interested where Matthew got that definition from, because it's not quite how I think of it. The way I think of it is that it is an economic system that unlocks the unused capacity of assets by matching needs and haves in ways that create greater efficiency and access. And it's those two words that are really important, greater efficiency and access. This is not the sharing economy. So I actually love it when people say, well, Despies is the sharing economy, or Washio is the sharing economy, or someone said to me the other day, this tie subscription service, like if you turn up an event and you have the wrong tie, you can press your phone and a tie will be delivered in 1 hour. This isn't the sharing economy. These are very clever on-demand apps. They are very clever on-demand apps that represent this very real need to want to get things in real time. And this is the Uberification effect. So there is a very clear distinction between those on-demand apps that are brilliant at efficiently matching supply and demand to give you things when you need them, and true sharing. So this idea has gone through a really interesting pendulum swing. And to me, this happened pretty fast. So as Matthew mentioned, I started researching and writing about these ideas in 2008. I brought my book out in 2009. This was a terrible time to bring this book out. Now, the reason why it was a terrible time, and some of you may know this, because I brought my book out, and in the first week, I'm looking down because my book agent is here and he doesn't like me sharing this story, but I sold 12 copies, right? Which is not what you want to do in the publishing world. And I was with my grandma at the time, and I got off the phone and I was pretty depressed that I'd only sold 12 copies because I thought this was going to be a huge idea. And she said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, I've written this book and I thought it was going to be this like huge world-changing idea, and I only sold 12 copies." And she said, "You didn't sell 12, you sold 6 because I bought the other 6 on Amazon." So you can always trust your grandma too, and she was a special lady. But it was a really good learning for me because ideas react to the context in which they were born. And I'd never thought about that before, rather naively. But my idea was reacting to the fact that we were in the middle of the biggest recession that we'd seen in decades. So everyone said that this was a hippie behavior, this was people being frugal, that this was going to disappear, it was a short-term trend. And it was all about cost saving. And it was really hard to convince people that this was actually a transformation in the way we would think about building companies. This was a transformation in the future of work. This was a transformation in trust. And things started to change around, I realize you can't see what I'm saying, things started to change around 2012. And in 2012, this was like the best thing ever. You know, this was all about empowerment, and the founders of Airbnb were heroes, and this idea was literally going to save the world. It was the easiest job to be representing the sharing economy because every media interview was positive. And then things began to change, and they rightfully began to change, and this healthy sense of skepticism started to emerge around 2013. And this healthy sense of skepticism has grown very fast over the last 3 years. And what people are questioning is this new? Or is this just capitalism on steroids? Does this create any redistribution of wealth? Is this just accelerating inequality? And these are really interesting questions to answer. Why do ideas and movements seem to go in these kinds of cycles of adoption? And it's interesting, it was mentioned in the opening that I teach at Oxford. I taught the course last year to these MBAs, and I'm teaching it this year. And the difference in the students, you know, the entrepreneurs would come in last year, they would be incredibly deferential. They are laying into them this year. These aren't the good guys anymore. These are just, you know, profit-hungry capitalists, which I find really interesting. So I thought, before I dive into the conversation with Matthew, I would just raise two big topics that I think are really interesting and are what the sharing economy is starting to bring to a head. So the first is this whole issue around the future of work. And the question that people are rightfully asking is, are the providers on the platforms, so the providers being hosts on Airbnb, or drivers on Uber, or lawyers on UpCounsel, or chefs on Eat With, is this empowering them, or is this exploitation? And this is a really big question, and it's a really big question way beyond the sharing economy, because I think we are heading into a future of platforms where companies will become these new kinds of intermediaries that essentially connect people with supply, with people with demand, breaking up traditional jobs into these micro, what people call gigs. So how we get this right, what is the role of platforms, what is the relationship between providers and platforms, is a really interesting question. So just to give you a sense of how big this is getting, these are the latest stats. We don't have great data at the moment in the United Kingdom, but they're estimating now in the United States more than a third of the entire workforce are now independent workers or freelancers. Now that depends on how you classify them. The latest study that was done was by JP Morgan Chase, and this study actually looked just at platform workers. And what they discovered was that in the last 3 years, there has been a 47-fold increase in the number of people earning income through platforms. It's become such a big issue that if you've been following the US, I mean, who hasn't been following the US election, it has actually become a topic for the candidates who are saying, how do we create a whole new social safety net if the future of work is going to be through platforms and independent workers? So one of the things that often frustrates me when we have this conversation is we forget a couple of things. We talk about workers as one big bucket, but there is a huge diversity of work, and there is a huge range of why people are doing this kind of work. So you have drivers on Lyft, and a third of all drivers on Lyft are either retirees or they're stay-at-home parents. This isn't a main source of income for them. You have people on TaskRabbit. Who's used TaskRabbit? What have you used it for? Putting pictures up on your wall. And the lady here? Fixing a bike. Fixing your bike, great. Anything unusual on TaskRabbit? I think I discovered the most unusual task of all time. This is something weird that I do, to look for these really weird things. And I look for these weird things to see how people think about using them in their lives. The point I'm going to make is it's a huge range of tasks that people are doing. I did not make this up. This is a real task. I'm going to have to read it to you in case you can't read it. And I actually called the guy because I had to know the story behind it, right? So to tell you the story, it was a guy and he bought a mattress and he had a really bad back. And he realized after he bought it, it was too hard. So he had to find someone to jump on his mattress to break the mattress in. And he thought, where in the world do I find someone? And he thought, TaskRabbit, of course, you think TaskRabbit. So as he says, you know, I've got this new mattress, it's really hard. I'd like someone to walk on it in relatively clean socks for 2 hours, maybe jump up and down a little. Jumping is optional, it's king, so your walking area will be 76 by 8 inches. I prefer someone with strong calves and some meat on their bones, beer included, and you can pet my cats if you need a quick break. Now, this is amazing, right? Because even I look at this and go, total weirdo, do not bid to run this task. 12 people bid to run this task on TaskRabbit. People want to jump on mattresses. So within one marketplace, how can you classify someone that is doing IT help and someone that is jumping on mattresses? And then the interesting thing is I was fortunate recently to spend some time with Clayton Christensen. As many of you know, he's like the doyen of disruptive innovation, and we spoke about how ideas often start in low-risk, low-value areas of your life, and then they move upstream. And this is exactly what's happening. So I'm married to a barrister. We often talk about how we would completely rip up the legal industry. And these platforms, they're very, very early, but they are lawyers saying, I have skills, I want to utilize my time differently, and maybe I don't want to belong to these big firms. So they're starting to sell their services directly. The piece that really flips them out is that they get rated. And they get rated not just on their performance, but things like billing efficiency. So if anyone's interacted with a lawyer, you'll know why this level of transparency is very new to the legal industry. So you have a range of different types of work, and then you have very different archetypes of workers. So I think of it in 3 categories. I think of them as professionals. So these are people that it's full-time work on these platforms. I think of it as flexers. So these are people who a full-time job, a 9-to-5 job at a fixed location is just not an option for them. People on the margins of employment, as I mentioned, retirees, stay-at-home mums and dads, people with disabilities. And then the most interesting category are moonlighters. And moonlighters are people with full-time jobs that are doing this work, often not just to make extra income, because they're looking for some kind of social connection. They talk about how they get something from doing this kind of work that they don't get from their traditional job. So, at the moment, the debate around the future of work is how we classify these people, because there's only 2 types of classification. You're either an employee or you're an independent contractor. And yes, it's really important that we figure this out, because there's a big grey area in the middle, but by the time the courts actually redefine who these people are, it's going to be too late. And so it's a huge opportunity to think really creatively on how we change the power structure, how we change the distribution of value between platforms and providers. So one of the things that I think is really interesting that might emerge over the next 5 years, and I don't think these are cooperatives, I don't think that's the right language for this, is the idea of network equity. I think the RSA calls it shared value. So how you can actually give providers on platforms who create the value and make these entrepreneurs and venture capitalists incredibly wealthy, how you can actually give them a share of the value that they create. So that's one area that I completely miss, the future of work, the tensions between providers and platforms, and how we sort out this massive inequality of value creation and value distribution. The second is around innovation and regulation. And so this is the geeky side of me. I find innovation and regulation, it's fascinating. If you research the history of innovation and regulation, it's a really, believe me, it is actually an interesting topic. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, who knows of the red flag trick? Just raise your hand, just so a couple of people. Okay, so I'll explain what it is. So when the car was introduced, there was a law that was called the 1865 Locomotive Act. And the 1865 Locomotive Act stipulated that if you owned a car, at all times there had to be 3 people in the car with you. And there had to be 3 people with you because one guy had to walk in front of the car waving a red flag. And why do you think he had to wave a red flag? To slow the car down. So the car couldn't drive more than 3 miles an hour. Now, who introduced this law? The stagecoach companies, the horse and carriages. And this law got so ridiculous, and this isn't a lie. In Philadelphia, if a car saw a horse and carriage approaching, the law stated it had to hide behind the bush, dismantle the car, remantle the car when the horse is gone in case it frightened the horse. This law stood up for over 30 years until people said this is completely ridiculous because you've removed the benefit of driving cars, and it turned out it was the incumbents lobbying for this Locomotive Act. So we can laugh at this now and go, that's ridiculous. You know, who would institute a law where you had to wave a red flag? But this is exactly what's going on between Uber and the taxi industry. I am going to mention them briefly. And the growth of Uber is astonishing. I actually had someone from Uber join my class, and he was even like, how can we be worth $62.5 billion? I mean, that's more than Rolls-Royce. It's more than most of the top Fortune 500 companies. And so what's really interesting to me about Uber is less Uber the company, but how people are responding. So this is a graph taken from San Francisco. If you ever need a reminding of the impact of Uber on the taxi industry, they've lost 2/3 of their revenue in the last 3 years alone. They think their lifeline is less than 6 months. So I look at graphs like this, and I think of Uber and taxis, and I want to say to the taxi industry, are you having your Kodak moment, right? Is this the point that your industry is forever changed and won't be reversed? But rather than embracing it, what are they doing? They're fighting this new behavior. So I thought it was really interesting that the Transport Authority tried to institute this law where if an Uber driver, wherever they were, even if they were around the corner to you, they would have to wait 5 minutes to pick you up. And they wanted to remove the fact that you could track Uber cars on your phone. So you read that, and it's exactly like the red flag trick. And so it hasn't worked, right? So what are the taxi associations doing? These are photos from the protests that happened last year around the taxi associations. And it's really interesting, when you speak to the taxi associations, she said, what did you hope to achieve by organizing these protests? And I kid you not, the majority will say that they thought the public were going to come out and say that you should ban Uber. And what happened on this day? So as many of you will know, Matt Hancock is a big supporter of this space. He's the Minister for Business. And this is just a brilliant tweet, right? He's like, does anyone have details of this Uber app everyone's talking about? I haven't heard about it today. And sign-ups increased by 850%. So this is the music industry all over again, right? This is Napster versus Spotify. What they've done is they've actually popularized the behavior they were trying to eliminate. And I find this so interesting that when you talk to governments, there's this belief that somehow they can reverse the story. Somehow they can reverse this idea that the public have discovered there's this new way to get around, but they can introduce regulation to reverse the story. And don't hear me right. I am by no means saying there is no role for government regulation. There is a role for government regulation. It's just that we need a completely new way of thinking of regulating these self-regulating markets. And that's a really interesting question. What will be the role of government regulation in the sharing economy? But I think this really says it all, because what's happening, again, comes back to trust. So the governments will say, well, these licensing systems, they are really important trust proxies. But when you speak to most users, they'll say, I actually trust the driver more. I'm even a little bit nicer to the driver because I know their name, I know their picture, I know their rating. It creates a better sense of accountability between the driver and the passenger. So this is really interesting and challenging to regulators because what they're saying is many of these institutional forms of trust, consumers actually, they're not relevant to people in terms of protecting them and keeping the market safe. So this, I think, is, and this is sort of a hat tip to where I'm going next, but this is what I think is actually happening, and one of the underlying shifts in the sharing economy is a shift in trust. And this is what I think is the most disruptive element and really, really interesting to study because you're coming out of an age of trusting traditional institutions and traditional I can't say the word, forget it, and moving into an age of distributed trust. And this is fascinating how this will emerge. I mean, it's building up with the blockchain, and it's not that traditional institutions are going to go away, but we're reimagining their role in society. So I could talk about many other things, but they're two of the things that I really missed, and the smartphone, which was a major omission, but you know, this tension between platforms and providers in the future of work and the real heated debate between innovation and regulation. I think these two themes will get a lot bigger. So the thought I want to finish with you today is I often get asked about this tech trend and I often get asked about these startups, and I think this is really missing the point about the potential of the sharing economy, because the reason why I found it so fascinating, and I still find it so fascinating today, is that it isn't a startup trend. These companies, they'll come and go. It's a transformative lens in how we think about value and how we think about trust between people. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. And my biggest challenge is how do I share this 25 minutes with you lot, because I just want to have it all to myself because there are so many questions I want to ask, but I will discipline myself to two or three and then open up to the rest of the room. So one of the things that fascinates me about technological change and its speed is the unpredictability of some of the consequences that flow from it. And some of these things are great and some of these things are not so great. So if you take that taxi thing, that's an interesting example. So I would kind of concur with you, largely speaking, but I have heard one very good argument from taxi drivers, which is that there are regulations that require taxis to be accessible for disabled people. They've got to be big enough for wheelchairs to go in them, yeah? So let's just imagine that graph applied to London. Let's just say the taxi business just collapsed. There was about 100 of them left, and they were kind of heritage vehicles. What's going to happen to disabled people who want to get around?
No, I completely agree with you. There's points where regulation is there to protect the market, but wouldn't it be better to say to Uber or say to Lyft that you need X percentage of your fleet to be disabled friendly? Isn't that a better conversation to have versus fighting over whether this thing is legal or illegal and it's just here? So I agree that there is a role of regulation to protect all consumers, and there's issues around discrimination that are starting to come to a head, but it's the approach and the conversation that is wrong. And I think these companies are more open to solutions than sometimes regulators expect. So absolutely, there is a role for government regulation, but it's more about how they can work with these platforms to cater for all people.
So you very kindly referred to the RSA's report. For me, the most interesting concept in that RSA report was the notion of kind of shared regulation, which was that you need regulation, but that the kind of old-fashioned regulation, which takes years to develop, and by the time you developed it, the world has moved on, and it tends to take a sledgehammer to crack a nut, won't work. What you need is some way in which providers, consumers, the public work together to create the kind of rules that will work. So first of all, I'm interested if you think that's the right idea. But then the second thing is, my sense a bit is that when you talk to some of the companies in this field and you say, look, there are these problems that are starting to emerge, concerns that start to emerge, their tendency is to say if we don't talk about them, they'll go away. So do you think that the industry as a whole is sufficiently willing to engage in difficult conversations, or are they in danger of waiting to the point at which public opinion drives government into cack-handed interventions?
Do you really believe they think if they don't talk about, I'm not sure I believe that. I don't think they're that naive that they think if they don't talk about this, it won't crop up. I think they have learnt their lesson from Uber and Airbnb, and there is a shift, and they're bringing in more senior people into those public policy regulation roles, and they're saying, you know, let's have the conversation before it becomes an issue. It's interesting. I've been working on this project with the UK government to try to develop a trust mark that the platforms will carry that will certify certain standards that the platforms have to meet. And it was really interesting doing the research with some of the platforms because one of the assumptions some of them made was that this wouldn't be about their responsibility to users. So this wouldn't be about what the platforms needed to do, so background checks and refunds and 24-hour customer service, that this trust mark would be far more focused on things they needed to put in place for providers and customers to behave well. And that's the thing, that's the piece that I think we need to flip, is there is with some of the companies, a dangerous mentality that we create this platform and all these people do the work and we're these facilitators, and whoa, we don't have any liability. You know, so if something goes wrong, the problem lies between the provider and the customer. And that I think is the big role that government can play in terms of what is the responsibility of the platforms to take on some of the liability and risk, because it can't just exist between providers and customers.
And do you think we need some kind of continuous capacity there? Because as I was saying, one of the things about this area is the way in which it develops in ways that you can't predict. So we were discussing before, weren't we, that Airbnb starts off primarily as people's second homes or spare rooms, and now it's used on the one hand by hotels, on the other hand by people to keep their head above water, otherwise they couldn't afford to live in a house at all. So it's kind of, you need in that situation for companies with the kind of strength that Airbnb have to have a continuous conversation, because the picture is continuously adjusting.
Yeah, and I think that's what many regulators struggle to deal with is the breadth of usage. I mean, you know, you talk about Airbnb, it's the range of supply, and so when people raise the tax question, for example, I'm often like, well, first of all, which tax are you talking about? You're talking about income tax, you're talking about commercial tax, and then you start to segment the Airbnb audience and you say, well, do you really want to treat the person who rents out their spare room 4 weeks a year and this is the only way they can offset their rent or pay for their holiday? Do you want to treat them the same as the commercial landlord? So I think this is, you know, trying to come up with policies and regulation that can meet the range of supply and meet the range of demand. I mean, that's why I tried to show that TaskRabbit platform. I mean, how on earth do you think about safety and protections for the person jumping on the mattress and the person offering IT support? So that's the beauty of marketplaces. But that's something that we're struggling to find a way through, is that you can't create these standardized protections because they don't work in a blanket fashion. So, and then just to give you an example of where the company can have a really good intention and they've got their hands tied. So I was recently with the founder of TaskRabbit, Leah Buskey, and she was talking about how she shares one of our concerns, which is learning, continuous learning. So if we're all independent workers, how will we learn? And so she's been looking at different things that TaskRabbit can do. She cannot even post on the TaskRabbit site a YouTube video that TaskRabbit hasn't created of someone teaching someone to hang a picture, because that's counted as employee training. And as soon as she puts that kind of knowledge sharing and training, these independent contractors could be perceived as employees, and she's open to a lawsuit. So I think in situations like that, where you have an entrepreneur that clearly has good intentions and really wants to figure out how you can upskill these providers, they almost have to create like a year of immunity. So you know what, go try these things and we will protect you and let's see what happens. but they're not being given that kind of freedom. They're being hit with lawsuits, so it's actually slowing the innovation down.
And finally, before we open it up, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that if we go back to when we were starting to talk about this, there was a hope that the whole sector would emerge that was kind of non-monetary.
Yes.
You know, where people would swap stuff, barter their time, barter their goods. It's not really taken off that side of things at all. Is that simply because without the driver of profit, you know, people aren't motivated and you don't get the innovation? I mean, because there are tens of thousands of kind of abandoned attempts to create non-monetary based sharing.
So I think I've thought a lot about this. They do exist, they just don't get spoken about that much. I think it links to two things. One is sadly, when you remove money from the equation, it's very hard for people to figure out the value exchange. So it creates this awkward social friction, and you see a lot of platforms where they start off free and then they introduce points and then they introduce their own, you know, currency, and then suddenly it's back to money again. So I think money is just, these are new behaviors for many people, so money removes that component of actually trying to figure out value. The other interesting thing is you know, interviewing people on these platforms, they often feel like, so Peerby is a really good example of this. When you've taken from the platform, you feel like you can't take again until you've given. So does that make sense? So like if I borrow toys on Peerby, I feel like I can't use that platform again until I've given. But the more interesting thing is I think there is a weird obsession with scale at the moment. Like, I see this with my students, like, it's got to be network effects, and it's got to have hockey stick growth, and we've got to expand all over the world, and it's world domination, and these things have got to be huge. And there is very little conversation around small, local, community. It's just not, it seems to have disappeared as an ambition. So it's like, how big is big enough for these ideas? You know, some of these ideas can only operate in one borough in London, and that's okay. But that's not seen as success for many of these entrepreneurs.
Actually, I think it's even more depressing than that, it's more depressing than that, which is that I was chatting to someone today who said that most startups in California who are trying to get money, the question they're asked by their potential venture capitalist is, when do you think this company will be successful enough to sell it to Google?
Sell it, yeah.
You know, so it's not just grow, but grow and then get out. You know,
and exit.
I mean, that's a gloomy account of entrepreneurism, it seems to me. Anyway, right, let's open it up to the room. Yeah, there's a microphone coming towards you.
Slightly mind-blowing, but thank you very much for all that big universe that you've painted for us. Something you touched upon was around how is this sharing economy helping kind of fast forward the kind of separation from the very rich from everybody else, or could it actually help slow that down and kind of pull it back together again? And do you have any, because you touched upon that and then left us dangling.
No, it's a great question. It really depends on the context. So in certain instances, both on the provider side, you know, I've met many providers who talk about how this income is enabling them to do things that were previously out of reach. So everything from putting their kids through college, or I think the flow-on entrepreneur effects are interesting. So the 10,000 hosts, I think it's now on Airbnb, who've started businesses from that income. So I think that's really interesting, how the incremental income can actually democratize access to all different things, whether that's education or starting a business. And then on the consumer side of things, you can say it does democratize access to goods and services that may not have been available to them. So, you know, the people who can travel because they can find a cheaper place to stay, the people who can have access to a car but they wouldn't be able to own it. So that's the positive side of the coin. But then how we fix that this doesn't become an economy of the haves and the have-nots. So a really good example of this was, and this really exists in the States, how people are just outsourcing their life to other people. I mean, I was in the US and a dear friend of mine, she wanted to go to a restaurant, and it was a restaurant that didn't take bookings. And I kid you not, she went on TaskRabbit and she paid for someone to stay in line for an hour so that we could just walk in and sit down. And I was so horrified. And that's just one real example of how, you know, the haves and it was just awful. It was embarrassing. But we got into this interesting conversation, and she's like, I just paid this person $20. You know, they made $20. They're very happy. What's wrong with this? So it's a tension.
Isn't it, though, Rachel, built into the network effect of this economy, which is that, you know, this is the kind of Google, Facebook phenomenon, that in the end the network effect means that it does naturally lead to massive global, not monopolies exactly, but hugely dominant players.
It does. And maybe I didn't understand your question correctly, because the thing it hasn't changed is the redistribution of wealth. So because these companies are still built on traditional forms of venture capital, traditional forms of equity structures, it has done nothing, to your point, to change incentives in terms of how these companies grow.
And so how does that then work out over time? Because absolutely the companies we're talking about, not just the sharing economy, but generally the tech sector is very, very innovative, but it gets to a position of market dominance, and everything that we know about economics tells us that when you get to that position of market dominance, you become flabby, less innovative. But can they ever be challenged? I think part of people's fear about Uber is that when Uber becomes dominant worldwide, that actually there'll be less innovation then, because it says nobody's able to challenge it.
So I think it's a difficult question to answer briefly, but I think they'll be challenged in strange directions that we can't even imagine. I mean, just to take an example, I think Apple's investment in, they just invested $1 billion in the Chinese competitor to Uber.
Right.
And now you see this race to own the future of mobility infrastructure. Now, that's brilliant when that happens, right? Because that's got to drive innovation, that's got to drive competition. So it's how at all times you don't have a dominant market player that has so much control over future behaviors that, that you could have Google and Uber controlling on-demand everything, that in our lives when we hit our phones to get something, those two companies service that.
So we should be, I get from that, you think we should be concerned about market domination?
No, 100%. And this is, we're going back to government, how do we continually create healthy competition, especially when the strategy is just give one company so much money that it's really hard for other entrants to come into the market.
Oh my word, there's a cluster of questions suddenly emerged. Why don't we try and take a little cluster of questions together? And
one's from Google, the other one's from Uber. Yeah.
What do you think has been the most successful or perhaps the most interesting way in which traditional companies have fought back against the disruptors?
I love that question.
Hold on to it.
Sorry, okay.
Hold on to it. I know who you are, but if you could say your name when you ask the question, that's better. That's great, yeah.
Hi Rachel, I'm Fiona. I'm totally inspired by your thinking, and I read What's Mine Is Yours for the first time last year, which has spurred me to embark on my own journey to set up a marketplace. In one of your most recent TED Talks, you talked about reputation passport, which I haven't heard much about since, and I'm really interested in that concept, so I'd love to know where you're up to with your thinking on that.
And then we'll go right to the corner of the room, and then you have to try and remember all four. Yeah, go on.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, it's Roddy here. It was more a point to something you both mentioned, which is the assets and the labour skills. I think there is a third one, which is knowledge, which is shared very widely through the sharing economy, and that answers your barter exchange. For example, Mumsnet is a massive free information exchange in the sharing economy. So I think you may not, obviously you do hear about Mumsnet, but you don't hear about it in that context, and there are loads and loads of those. So knowledge is shared very widely and freely because it's not immediately commercializable or monetizable.
Great, and then pass it back right to the corner of the room.
Hi there, I'm Gulegom Tembu. Surprisingly, I'm from the Republic of South Africa. Quick question, how do you see the concept or the notion of sharing economy penetrating emerging markets like South Africa?
Right, there's some maybe easy questions, and I think you've got 3 minutes to answer them, so we can take another round. So, how have people fought back? I think you just agree the knowledge points. You don't need to answer that, and then the other two questions.
How the most interesting way traditional companies have responded. So, let me knock out the uninteresting ways, or non-interesting ways. Investment. Forget it. Partnerships, usually a marketing ploy. The most interesting I find is when a company says, how can we play a different role in our customers' lives? So, and this is often what I think people mean by disruption. So if the role that we're playing becomes obsolete, how do we reimagine how we create value in people's lives? So a really good example of that, Alex is sitting there, so I'm not trying to plug Just Park, but I am going to plug Just Park. So BMW, they are saying, you know, it won't be in car ownership, it will be in mobility. So they've done car sharing, but then they've partnered with Alex, who runs Just Park, and it's a parking marketplace, and they've embedded that in the steering wheels of their cars. And that's a really good example of a car company saying, you know, maybe the future of our business isn't selling cars, it could be mobility in its widest form. So how do we reimagine the role in our customers' lives? How do we rethink the way we deliver value? I think that's the right response for companies. The reputation question. Yes, so I spoke about reputation capital, and it was the idea that we were leaving all these pieces of reputation data, and in some way they would be aggregated through a dashboard that would create this new kind of currency, that we would all have reputation capital statements. I didn't realize that all these people would go out and try and build, which was naive again. And where it went horribly wrong, that we're now moving on from, is everyone tried to create the equivalent of a FICO score. Or FICO score, sorry. So like, oh, I'm going to take your contribution to Wikipedia, I'm going to take your host rating, I'm going to take how many views you have on YouTube, and you will now have a reputation score of 375. And this isn't what I meant in terms of reputation becoming a currency. I think we are now entering the second wave of really thinking about online reputation. And it'd be really exciting to see whether it exists on the blockchain. So will companies own our reputation data, or will we start to aggregate that? And I think we're starting to see companies get it right. So there's a company called Traity, and they're looking at using reputation data to fix problems where people don't have traditional credit histories. So to link it to the last question, think about emerging markets where people don't have a credit history. They're trying to move into the big city to get a job, and they're never going to get a rental agreement because they have no way to prove their behavior. Could they take their reputation data and use it to get things like rent and leasing agreements? Emerging markets is interesting. I think what is going to be fascinating is whether we apply these ideas in two ways. One, will we actually bypass traditional developed world infrastructures that didn't serve people particularly well? So I think we're seeing that with mobile phones versus landlines. You know, do we really need to, you know, banks versus M-Pesa? And so I'm really interested in the sharing equivalence, where we will look at the inefficiencies of things that we built in the developed world, and use this shared way of thinking to think completely differently about infrastructure. So I think we've seen it with phones, we've started to see it with payments, and there'll be many other categories. I also think there are problems in emerging markets, such as traffic congestion, where this thinking can be really powerful. Do I think it's going to completely bypass consumerism and people won't have aspirations to own? No. I still think those markets will go through those types of cycles, and we won't be living in a rental economy.
Final round of questions. We've got one from Twitter at the front, and then I'll take these three here all conveniently together. So, Twitter question first.
So Danny from Twitter asks, is anonymity a value or a possibility for the future of work in the sharing economy?
Okay. And then let's take those three together.
There's a certain ideological implication with the word sharing, and you wanted not to mention the U word, but we share Ubers as much as we share Learjets, in that we have access to a market for transportation. How do we share things that aren't sexy or things that will profit people who may develop a platform to share these things, like nappies, for instance, or cordless drills?
Okay, and then two more.
One of your diagrams had trust and efficiency. In terms of developing that trust, some of the inefficiencies you talk about are actually the legal processes, the trademarks. So over time, if that is developed, then those costs are going to have to come back on top of what you're calling inefficient costs.
And then finally,
Alex Stephanie from Just Park, thanks for the plug. Rachel also wrote a book called The Business of Sharing about this kind of stuff. You talked a lot about trust and reputation and reviews, and clearly standards of behavior are rising at scale. People are treating Uber or Lyft drivers better in many cases than they treated taxi drivers, and people are treating their Airbnb rooms better than they often treat hotel rooms. Conversely, you're seeing some data that racist and other kind of prejudices are also being reflected in these transparent platforms. So I'm just going to go a little deep for a second and ask you, do you think there's any kind of relationship between the sharing economy either now or in the future when it's even larger and more influential, and ethics or indeed morality?
What a great question. So, in your remaining time, you might want to flip around the first few, but focus and finish on that last one. That's great.
Okay, so
Anonymity.
Anonymity. Could you remind me of the question? Just phrase it so.
Is anonymity a value or a possibility for the future of work in the sharing economy?
Unfortunately not. So I think, just to be honest, I think the age of pseudonyms, being anonymous, even unverified identity, so not even being able to verify who you are in the real world, is over for this era of work. And the thing that scares me about it is how, it's on my mind, 'cause I've been talking to students quite a bit about this, is how it's not that you're losing your privacy, it's that you're losing a culture of forgiveness that will forever be attached to your digital identity. So I think it's not that you have to reveal who you are, it's that everything that you do could become very public, and that you're going to be under this constant state of assessment and monitoring that could be very unhealthy and frightening for people. I'm not sure if I was rated. I'm used to being rated and reviewed. I mean, you know, my students rate me, they say lovely things, they say horrible things. I'm used to that, and still it gets me at a core level. And I think most human beings aren't ready for this constant state of monitoring. But I do think the age of anonymity in this future of work is over.
We kind of covered the question, I think, about how hard it is to do non-monetary, or, I mean, but there's lots of sharing platforms that aren't sexy stuff, aren't there? I mean, there's...
Yeah, no, I mean, we're never going to share nappies, right? Like, I mean, there's certain things we're not going to share, no offense to the question, but there's really unsexy stuff that is highly successful. So some of the platforms that never get talked about, Muni-Rent. I mean, in governments in the US, they're figuring out how to share council equipment, which I think is a great use of sharing. You know, does every district need a road sweeper, or can they actually use taxpayers' money more efficiently and create these shared infrastructures? So I think there's capacity. The B2B applications, they never get spoken about, or the industrial applications, but they're as interesting. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So, kind of. Third one was...
I didn't really understand that, but trademarks and...
trademarks and friction.
Yeah. Well, you understand it.
So, yes and no, and I know that's not an answer to the question. The really interesting piece of this, and I'll come back to the legal stuff and the insurance, I find a common response now to entrepreneurs is that they see the human interaction as friction. So it's like, oh, we have to meet up in person and exchange keys, or like, that's going to slow me down, or there's coordination costs, or we should just get rid of that and we'll make it on demand. So that to me is a very frightening component, that we just feel the need to remove all humanness for the sake of convenience. And I think what you actually see is a good example of this is Turo in the US, which is a peer-to-peer car sharing platform. And they did this massive partnership with GM where they removed the key exchange and it was all like this whiz-bang system, and their claim rates went through the roof because people were treating the cars completely differently because they never saw the owner. So they went back to this system where you actually had to look the owner in the eyes. I don't think the transaction costs, when you add in insurance and other traditional measures, I don't think they'll come down on the customer. I think they're often absorbed by the provider, and that's the worry, is that the provider's cut gets less and less. So you see this, that the amount of commission the company takes to absorb those costs. So yes, it is an issue.
And then finally, ethics. In the end, will the sharing economy make the world a better place? I'm kind of interested, by the way, just to link that to this kind of reputation issue, is that one of the people who came for a Student Design Award today was talking about a kind of aggregate platform so everyone has a single rating. And then part of the reason we invited him in was we liked the fact that he thought this was also quite a frightening idea, which is this kind of notion. And then it occurred to me that for 99% of human existence, we've lived in communities where everybody knew everybody else. In fact, people had a grudge against not just you, but because of what your grandfather had done. So in a way, if we go back to a world where people kind of know what our reputation is, that is simply going back to the state of human beings for most of our existence.
Well, things always go full cycle. I mean, we're not actually that creative as... can you phrase the question, Alex? Because I think you're getting at something quite different. Could you just ask the question one more time, Alex, so I can answer it properly? Is it about the ethic? Do I think this is tied to bigger ethical questions?
Does it make people behave better or worse? I think that was your point, wasn't it?
I mean, I was speaking about how transparency is improving behaviour.
Yes.
But in some respects, some of the data shows that it's actually not improving behaviour. And so the question is there a relationship between the sharing economy at huge scale and ethics or morality? I think that's kind of similar to...
Yeah, I've got it. So at the end of the day, do I think this will make people behave better? 100%. I think it will, both people, individuals and companies, the level of transparency that we will expect from these companies and platforms, the fact that we will have these very direct forms of accountability will make people behave better. I think what's interesting about what you're talking about, Alex, so I think referring to the Airbnb study of discrimination, I think that study is important, but I think it's replicating what happens in the real world. And
this was a study, by the way, that found that people's ratings reflected...
Their bookings.
So their bookings reflected racial stereotypes.
Yes, so it was done by Harvard, and they tested the same place, and one host had an African-American name, and basically they had 16% lower bookings. And it became this big media story. But I think that is actually just replicating discrimination in the real world. And I think what becomes interesting is how we can design systems of trust to actually overcome those problems. But what often doesn't get talked about is the flip side of that. So I've met many hosts who say, and I say this frankly, I would never think of having a lesbian couple from Russia stay in my home. So I think the people that it opens human beings up to possibilities that weren't previously possible. But I think what freaks me out and is very frightening is this is a whole new world of making decisions about people and what we should buy and how we should behave. And none of us are ready for that world. That for me is the massive change. Not being anonymous, constant monitoring, identity on the blockchain, continuous ratings and reviews, the future of work not being part of companies. That's a reimagining of our social identity that we're not growing up and preparing ourselves for. So I think it's going to be a really exciting and frightening decade in the way that this evolves.
Great, well, thank you very much. So if this has whetted your appetite and you'd like to know more, you should read Rachel's first book, and you should then read her next book, which is going to come out quite soon, I suspect.
Whenever I finish.
Whenever you finish it, very good. And you should also read Bromley's report, which is on the RSA website. Good. It's a really good report, I think, and we're doing more work on the sharing economy. It's been a really fantastic session, and Airbnb have kindly offered to share with you a drink afterwards. So if you go through those doors, there'll be a bar open out there. So please stay around and continue the conversation. It just remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking Rachel Botsman.